Exactly, I've got my sabbatical brain going at the moment.
So thank you all for being here, and special thanks to my committee. The title of my dissertation is Eating Change, a critical autoethnography of community gardening and social identity. So I'm going to introduce the research context, then I'll explain to you the conceptual framework that I used for this research. Then I'll introduce the research question and the methodology and methods that I used to explore that question. I'll share with you just a very brief overview of my findings. I'll describe some of the limitations, provide an overview of discussions, recommendations, scholars, and practitioners. And at the end, we will have a little time for some questions. All right, so I'll start with my researcher identity, which is important in an autoethnographic methodology because although it is ethnography and a study of community and culture, it is studied through the lens of one's own experience. And so one's identity is central and it's explicit within the study, as opposed to trying to remove oneself from the culture and study it objectively. One is very immersed in it. And so the researcher needs to contend with many facets of their identity. And so I've written a list of the most relevant ones here in the photo. And it's relevant to the study because we have the possibility of crafting very unique and very complex understandings of the research question itself based on these different facets of our identities and the ways that they interact. I'm also going to provide you a brief overview of the foreshadowed problem of this research. A foreshadowed problem is a concept that was originally introduced in positivist research, but autoethnographers use a foreshadowed problem as a means to understand the context in which a research problem or question arises. It has to do with the critical incidents that lead us to become unbalanced or broken apart. Our worldview, it becomes in question at some point. And so for me, the foreshadowed problem has to do with a timeline just up until the point of data collection for this project began. And this timeline has an intersection of both personal and social events, as well as economic, environmental, and political events. Without going into too much of the detail, I became a homeowner for the first time in 2005, planted my first garden and started raising chickens shortly thereafter. But in the larger picture, there were environmental and political crises all coming to a head. And then in 2009, I became a single parent and became completely responsible for the property, the food, and feeding my 3 children. To provide a little bit more of the regional and national context for this, New Hampshire suffered a little bit more of the brunt because of the way our economy is set up during this time. And it is a well-studied phenomenon that in single-parent households, male head households versus female heads of households, experience about twice as much household food insecurity to their male counterparts. And this has real measurable and significant impacts, not only on individual mental health, but public health as well. And so this leads into the conceptual framework. After 2009, I became involved in studying community food systems and specifically higher education involvement in community gardening systems. And so what you see in this concept map is some concentric circles with community food systems being the largest circle, community gardening efforts fitting within those, and then a subset of community gardening efforts that involve higher education institutions. And my lived experience is right in the center of those nested systems. That's what I'm examining. And I'm using critical theory and social identity theory to examine that lived experience in that larger community and cultural context. So I'm looking in, but I'm also looking out. If you're not familiar with community food systems already, as opposed to industrial, so I'll re-explain my conceptual framework. The cultural context in which the study takes place is within community food systems. And community gardening efforts are one type of effort within community food systems. And of that, higher education holds a subset of those community gardening efforts. And within these nested systems is where my lived experience takes place. So I'm examining that center, and critical theory and social identity theories are the theories that I use to examine this experience. And so I'm both looking out from the outside to the in at my own lived experience, but I'm also at the center looking outward into my community and culture. Libby, are you able to advance the slide? Clicking anywhere on the screen? Okay. To contrast community food systems from the sort of global industrial food system, community food systems are focused on the environmental, social, and nutritional health of a particular place. So they tend to be smaller in scale, but also different in intention in that they promote health, resilience, fairness, and sustainability. That is at least the intention. And the relevance of higher education in this context is the increasing call among academic and community circles for asking more questions about institutional privilege and social justice within these efforts. A call to ensure that that higher education's involvement, sorry about that. We're just trying to make sure that we're still recording, which I think that we're not.
You are.
I am. Great, thank you. All right, so there's a focus on not just filling people's minds with knowledge, but helping people to become agents of change and community members so that we don't end up exacerbating or simply repeating the problems that we're trying to solve. And so this brings me to the research question, which is, what do community gardening and social identity have to do with one another? A way that I experience this question when I'm in the garden is, who are we and who do we become through the act of community gardening? The geographic and cultural context in which this takes place is in the Monadnock region of New Hampshire in the northeastern United States. The flowers that you see in the map are where I have had most of my lived experience and collected the most data for this study. Keene, which is the largest flower, contains 1/3 of the population of this entire region. It is largely a white place with 94% identifying. And although we experience less food insecurity than the rest of the country overall, still over 1/3 of households qualify for federal free and reduced school lunch, which is one measure of food insecurity. And so the methodology I use of autoethnography is an inquiry of community and culture. As I mentioned, the researchers' lived experience is central. And so when you read autoethnography, it has a very autobiographical read to it. But the emphasis is on cultural interpretation, using the lived experience as a source of data, because the researcher's experience is inextricably linked to that culture. Critical autoethnography, because the stories that exist in our cultures are sometimes so assumed, so embedded as to be almost invisible, but those invisible assumptions have real consequences for people's lives. And so since critical theory asks questions about power and privilege and who benefits and who is oppressed and who is harmed because of the social rules that we have set up, critical autoethnography challenges social narratives and creates possibilities for new ones. The methods I used for data collection were varied. They involved, I'll show you in the next slide, some of the more specific methods, but overall, data was collected either at the same time or immediately following a period of immersion in an experience. I used a variety of strategies in order to use rich data, which is really one of the defining aspects of this qualitative research. The data themselves were either internally sourced or externally sourced. So internally sourced means personal memory through journaling, tracking events, time cycles, artifacts of mine that came from a lived experience. And I used a series of writing exercises by Chang and some additional guidance by Hughes and Pennington and others to collect these data. So I kept track of and labeled each type of data. Self-observation of my thoughts and behaviors, either in the past or in the current moment. Self-reflection using field journals, also using those writing exercises. And self-analysis using tools like a culturegram or a Venn diagram. And I'll show a picture of one of those in the next slide. Externally sourced data included archives, and those could be either text archives, so newspaper articles and other things that I had written and others had written, as well as non-textual, so photos and videos, things like that. And then interviews, which were autoethnographic interviews, also known as autoethnographic conversations. This is a picture of a culturegram, one of the writing tools used for self-analysis, the template that's given, and then the direction that I took it with one of mine. In those autoethnographic interviews, I used purposeful sampling following Patton, Cresswell, and Plano Clark. I used an interview guide with open-ended questions so that the partners in my conversations could weren't restricted in their answers. We spent about an average of 1 hour per conversation, and those were conducted in person whenever possible. The data collection, analysis, and interpretation stages happened in sort of an iterative fashion. So as I would reflect and analyze on the data, it might spark a memory of, oh, there's another conversation I should go back to and collect more data. And so the stages went back and forth a bit. And even Chang, who quite literally wrote the book on autoethnography as method, says that there's no consensus on whether a stage of analysis and interpretation even exists. So it was a very emergent process, but as to the extent possible, I was able to track my data collection, which will never be finished, by the way, because this is an ongoing process. But for the purposes of a dissertation, there was a stopping point, of course. The findings took the form of 3 autoethnographic chapters, which can be read independently, but also are related to each other. So the first focuses on the experience of food insecurity leading up to and catalyzing my involvement in community gardening efforts. The second has to do with the ivory tower and the garden shed and the differences in cultures within the same community. The third has to do with gardening as a composition of environmental identity and really the coming together of the theories and practices. Among the 3 autoethnographies, I used this structure for all 3 there's a metaphor here that I describe as a vine and trellis. So think of the trellis as the theoretical or conceptual framework. This is our culture. This is the ways that we have of thinking about who we are and what the world is made of. And it's a relatively steady sort of thing. The vine, you can think of a vignette from a painting or a vignette from a movie as a small piece of a larger picture, and it's set against a larger cultural backdrop. And so the pieces that I wrote have these vignettes. They're examinations of a portion of my lived experience. They come off like stories. And then I pull away and examine sort of the cultural interpretation of this. What does this mean in terms of my community and kind of these bigger social questions? And so the vignettes rest on the trellis, like the way that a vine rests on a trellis. And that structure carried through all of the 3. And so these are a sampling of some of the vignettes that I described my lived experience, and then sort of dovetail in between that and the larger cultural interpretation. That photo, for example, is in the very same garden where I first experienced community gardening and had a hard time accepting the generosity of others to partake in tasting tomatoes from that garden, because I hadn't yet reckoned with the fact that I am, in fact, the very community that this garden is intended to serve. So that's an example of a vignette in that autoethnography. The second has to do with sort of navigating the dynamics of working in a higher education institution, working with people in a corporate environment, and working with people who are experiencing food insecurity, and what kind of complexity comes out of that. The metaphor that I use for that is boots and baskets. And so an everyday experience would be trying to figure out what I carry with me into my day when I'm going to be in a corporate environment, getting muddy, and also having to come home at the end of the day with some food. And the third autoethnography, it deals very much with metaphor. It also takes a direction a little bit away from sort of an analytical tone into an evocative tone, and where I started to experiment with forms like Ellis and Bachner, where my interpretation of experience takes on a little bit less of a literal interpretation. Some of the cross-cutting themes across the autoethnographies is that culture, identity, and gardening are all creative processes. They're always ongoing all the time. As we are doing what we're doing with intention, with meaning, we are co-creating culture, and in turn, that culture is informing our identity. And for me, the garden has always been where this takes place. And so that similarity was very, very strong among all of the autoethnographies. Another cross-cutting theme is seeing oneself as a garden and seeing the community that you belong to as kind of the larger ecosystem. And when you start to look at community and culture in that way, the role of the gardener becomes more than just someone who's in there digging dirt. They're also building those social connections. They're also starting to inform the kind of culture that's around them. And bridging individual and collective, or the personal and political aspects of this practice. Some of the implications of this research I found were have to do with intersectionality. Intersectionality theory is credited to Kimberly Crenshaw, and originally it has to do with the voices of Black women. Since her research has gone on to other identities and deals with not accepting that we are only this or only that, or even this and that, but really seeing that the interaction of those identities within our experience is very important and key to how we go about in the world. Another implication has to do with stigma and oppression. If any of you has either experienced this or worked with people who have experienced this, you know that there is a lot of external and internal stigma having to do with food insecurity and other issues regarding food and health. And so life writing is a way to address that stigma, and in a way to push back against it and bring to light some conversations that are kind of hard to have sometimes about power. This says implications. I should correct that and say that this is more of a recommendation for those working in community food systems, is to have is to approach issues of power and privilege with some sensitivity to the lived experiences of community members. And that can take any number of forms depending on the cultural context in which we're working. I also recommend more participatory approaches to narrativizing and storytelling, to learning and teaching, and also to research and evaluation. A couple of limitations to my study. I would like to explore more, or I would recommend that other scholars explore more possibilities for collaborative autoethnography in addition to independent autoethnography. There, in the research and literature that I came across, this was described as very hard to do in an authentic way, but I think it's worth exploring and worth doing. I also would recommend exploring analytical versus autoethnography. They both have, there's very interesting conversations in the literature about the benefits and drawbacks of each. I think that autoethnography is still a very evolving method, and the order of the data collection, analysis, and interpretation could really use to be explored and picked at a lot more. I think if I had done certain things in a different order, I could have turned out with, you know, somewhat different stories. And that's part of the beauty of the method as well. And then, of course, there's always going to be room for differing and competing cultural interpretations. And so I recommend future scholars really look at, you know, how do we contend with different interpretations? If a couple of people are looking at their own lived experiences and come up with different interpretations of that, what can that tell us? In the interest of time, because I know that we're running a bit short here, I will say that using personal experience within community food systems does hold a lot of promise, according to Holman Jones, Adams, and Ellis, whose work I really regard well. Commenting on cultural practices, contributing to existing research, embracing vulnerability, and creating a reciprocal relationship with the people that you're doing this research with holds a lot of promise in community food systems research. Scholars with any interest in either community food or community gardening or anything related to higher ed and community involvement, even outside of food and gardening, should pay a lot of attention to their positionality, use reflexivity and relational ethics, which has a lot to do with, you know, you do this research and then you go out into the world and there is your community. And so what you say in your research goes with you into the world. And so at the end of the day, you know, how does that change, or how do you protect those relationships? And community food systems research can also be community building. It's not just about the thing. It is the thing. For practice, those outside academia, a couple of recommendations that came out of this are considering privilege and authority with regard to community food efforts. Authority as in, you know, who can speak to someone's lived experience the best. Often it is the people who have lived it, and often their voices are not necessarily the ones that are reflected. And so also replacing the word charity with community in every instance, every instance. So as we wrap up, I showed you a little bit of the foreshadowed problem in the time period leading up to the My Data collection. And now as we have entered the post-2020 world, I offer an epilogue that the story is still ongoing. The gardening is the story, and the story is resistance. So someone told me one time that you can't eat change. It turns out that you can, in fact, eat change, and you might not be able to get all your calories from a little garden, but you get so much more than that. I've posted a few of the selected references from this work, and I offer some time for your questions.
That you're pulling up the chat, but we'll have to co-facilitate this.
Yep. So here's this.
Questions. Lots of accolades, Jess.
Thank you.
Are there questions? We have time for a few questions here. Oh, Abby, take it away.
Hi, thank you. Apologies for the voice, getting over COVID.
Sorry.
Cameras off for a good reason. So Jess, I really don't have a question for you. I really just want to applaud this work that you've completed. And I really am, there's so much to unpack in what you just presented in a very short time. I hope you're planning to write a book based on this dissertation. And the very last recommendation that you put forward about replacing the word charity with community makes my heart very happy. I think if that's the one thing that comes out of your research and the work that you've done, that's the game changer. I mean, that's transformational and is so important. So I just want to applaud your work and congratulate you, and thank you.
Thank you, Abby, for saying that. I have gotten a couple of suggestions to write a book out of this. I'm going to give myself a little pause before I think about that anymore. But replacing the word community, replacing the word charity with community really came out of an experience that everyone who participates in these efforts is in a position to help in some way, whether they realize it or not. And they are also in a position to be helped. And that could be because, something drastic happens and now all of a sudden they've lost an ability that they had before, whether that's transportation or their health or what have you. And they become reliant on others. And that's really hard for people sometimes to realize. I didn't realize that I was eligible for SNAP, for supplemental nutrition assistance, for a very long time, because I was walking around with this cultural assumption that it was for people who were homeless or completely disabled. And it took some experience to realize that, I'm in a position where I need help, right? And it wasn't so much of a pride thing, but just, this is how people get to this situation, right? So those assumptions upended. But then years later, I'm working in community gardens with people who in some ways have a lot of privilege, graduate students, people who have full-time jobs, and yet they are also being helped because this is a refuge for them, or because this is like the one time that they don't have to be responsible for anything else but themselves and that little piece of earth. And so there's so much going on behind the surface. And so anyway, thank you.
So I want to note Joanne has a question, and then there is a question from, I believe, Michael in the chat.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. It was really a great presentation. I have several questions, but I'll just ask one. You ended with something like gardening is the story, and the story is resistance. I'm paraphrasing and getting it wrong, but my question is, through this autoethnographic process, how did you change? And I guess kind of part B of that, was resistance something that you thought of as the story when you started researching, or when you started the whole process back in 2006, whenever starting point you choose?
Yeah, so that's so interesting. I think the first question would take a little more time to answer, and I want to have like a one-on-one with you and catch up, because so much has changed in the last 10 years. But as far as whether I set out to write a story of resistance, that wasn't my initial impetus. It was really just to find out as much as I could about, why is community gardening so awesome, interesting, fascinating, and challenging, and who belongs in a community gardening, and what does that belonging really mean, right? And the resistance part really came from someone in my community telling me, you can't eat change, because I was very concerned with in the moment, how do I get my kids healthy, good food and stay afloat and do something that's meaningful all at the same time? And it's kind of impossible. And they were pointing out, like, just get over yourself, right? Just do what you got to do and stop trying to be so virtuous, is what they were trying to say. And that's where I wanted to say, to borrow a phrase, like, instead of like, hold my beer, like, watch me, I came up with a subtitle of hold my beat, right? Like, I just want to show you that, okay, no, fine. I mean, maybe I can't satisfy all of, the planet's needs for a wholesome food system, but, you can make a meaningful life if you choose to do so. So I hope that answers your question for now.
So Jess, I'd recommend concise response to Michael's question, and then Jean, you can bring us home, Jean, with as the final question.
So Misha's asking the biggest challenge in finding measurable results in my work, apart from the weight and amount of food grown. So this is an interesting question because we do want measurable results, right? But at the end of the day, are those measurable results the most meaningful results? So they're an indicator, yes, that there's a community that cares, that we're making progress toward addressing people's very material everyday needs. But in this kind of qualitative research, I had to realize that it's not necessarily what we can measure that matters the most. So there were lots of challenges. I appreciate that question very much.
And Jean, bring us home, friend.
Thank you. Congratulations, Jess, amazing. Two questions. So you talked about purposeful sampling. I might have missed it. Can you share how you selected your participants? And then the second question is, doing this work, what would you say was the most rewarding?
Oh, Jean, I always love your questions. They're so hard sometimes. For purposeful sampling, I chose people that I shared significant lived experiences with. So, for example, we had worked in either a colleague or a co-volunteer or even a supervisor and worker type of relationship, or as educator and student, and had spent some time in the garden together in the research context in that intersection of higher education and community gardening. And people that there was already an existing sense of rapport and respect and trust. Because those are assets to autoethnographic research, whereas in other research paradigms, they might be perceived as a lack of objectivity. That wasn't the intention of this research. It was really to explore that subjectivity and our mutual investment in the research. So as far as what was the most rewarding, I think in addition to the food that I grew during that 10-year period, I think that it was the relationships within my community that was the most rewarding. And being able to be vulnerable and to create space for other people to be vulnerable too.
Well, that is a lovely question in response to wrap this public presentation aspect up with. So I just thank you again, Jess. Thank you all for coming. Round of applause. And we'll ask that folks head out, and Joy and Kim, if you can stay with us. Why don't we take at least a 3-minute break and come back at least 10 till.
Great, Jess. Thank you. Learned a lot about.
Jess, I have to say, first of all, it was just a delight to sit down and read something new, because as you know, Sharice's defense was yesterday, and that's been read many times. So it was just nice, both last week and then I reread your work this week, and it was very readable. I don't always get my mind around all of the constructs and the vocabulary I'm working on. I'd love to have a copy of your presentation, because I found that it was just an excellent overview and that you presented it very well. So I think both the writing and the presenting really appreciated that. I love the way that you started with researcher identity. I think that was, for me, coming from a positivist approach to a qualitative approach in my own research. That was something that I learned about and struggled with. And so I just, it's great to see that up front. I also like the notion of foreshadowed problem, because certainly that was part of my experience in history, but I just thought, oh, that's just me, or, you know, there wasn't really a name for it. So it's good to see that. Having taught theory and practice seminar, or maybe it was dissertation proposal seminar so many times, it's like, an elegant conceptual framework diagram. This is great. You know, so many people had boxes or arrows, and I thought that you really captured that very well. So I have a number of questions. I'll just, you know, maybe shoot out one and then give Kim a chance. And if we have time, you know, come back around. But, you know, one of the things that you note is the importance, particularly in autoethnographic research or any auto research, of challenging your own assumptions and challenging the dominant discourses that are the kind of stories that we live by often. And I'm wondering, how did you go about enacting those challenges? Was it systematic? Was it like waking up in the middle of the night and like, oh crap, I just said what they all say? How was that as both a research approach and a lived experience for you?
I tried to be as systematic as possible. I even explored some of the, qualitative analysis research software, and, combed through like a collection of articles. I started, I think, with like newspaper articles and clippings that were already written, and tried to do some, coding and things in that way, in the prescribed way, to see, try to take myself out of it and just see what's written down about it. If I died and somebody had to do an analysis on my lived experience, and that all they had was whatever was left behind of my journals and news clippings and things like that, how would they go about finding an answer to the research question? I found some usefulness in that, and if I were trying to piece together someone else's lived experience, I might try to do that. But I found mostly that this was not very helpful in identifying assumptions and, how did you say it, my own and some of the other discourses that we kind of live by. I think what was more helpful was reading others' autoethnographies, which had to do with anything from, was it paragliding or some kind of extreme sport? Anderson did. Autoethnographies of Black women living in the South, for example. Tilly Lubbs was another one, an educator, and reading through their process of challenging, and starting to do that for myself. And I would just sort of like have this ongoing question as I go about the daily tasks. And, I'm picking up a box of vegetables. Like, what does that mean? I'm an alien from another planet and observing this member of a culture, picking up a box of vegetables. What does that mean? And just trying to, just be conscious about the internal boxes, the imagination boxes within me.
Thank you. Yeah. And if I can jump in with another one, and this might mean looking at one of your slides, but I was very interested in the dissertation at the diagram of a culturegram. And I noticed that you also had a picture of how you worked that out, but I didn't really understand, looking at that diagram, how it worked. Where is there a starting place? Do you start from the outside and work in? You start from the in and work out? I just, looking at it, wouldn't have known how to do that myself. And I wondered if you could share a little bit more about what it's like to do a culturegram.
Sure. I didn't bring Chang's book with me, but the culturegram that they prescribe starts in the middle, and sort of radiates out from there into more and more boxes, kind of like how one might do a concept map. And it just asks you to begin with, what are all your different identities? Maybe pick your top 5. So like mine might be mother, gardener, student, educator, and environmentalist. And then it would ask you to pick apart each of those and say, okay, well, things like where does that identity come from? You know, who else is involved in that relationship? Like if I say I'm a mother, that implicates that there are others being my children, right? And then that starts to map out some of the relationships between my personal identity and my social identities.
Okay.
And then you can just work out from there. And so I just like spirals. So I ended up doing like sort of these arc forms instead of the box forms. But that exercise was also really good for pointing me toward other forms of data collection and self-reflection. So personal memory data would come up. Other kinds of events and timelines would come up. I think one of them was mentors. So for example, I would think of Libby, I would think of Kin Schilling, I would think of other mentors that I had, and that would prompt me to go back to the interview and things like that. So it was useful as its primary use in self-analysis, but also its secondary use in prompting self-reflection and other kinds of data.
Right, so you could see maybe gaps in the culturegram where you haven't explored as fully as others, or maybe highlight the identities, that social identities that seem most relevant.
Yeah, there's probably a lot that gets left out of those exercises too, the things that I'm just not thinking of, or somebody else might point out and they'll say, oh, I didn't realize you saw me that way. So that could actually be a really interesting one to do as a collaborative exercise.
Yes, yeah. I mean, where's the roller derby in all this? You know, it's just not showing up, Jess. And yet when I think of you, yeah, it's always there.
The same thing. There's roller derby in all of this.
I don't
I'll
want
let Kim have a turn here.
No, this is great. And I've always wanted to do roller derby, so I'm kind of missing out here.
I'll be in New York a couple of times this summer. You should join up.
I have thought about it for a long time. It's so funny. I love that. I just wanted to start as well with just really appreciating the dissertation. You know, every bit of work we do as scholars and in praxis, to me, is always personal. I mean, it just depends how you define and put forward that intersection of your personal and the political. But I think the way clearly it's very deliberate in your work. And I just thought there was a lot of, it's kind of what you hope for when you read someone's work, the earnesty and the deliberation with the layers that you're proposing. This really came through for me. And I just thought it was really well done. And I don't think this is easy to do. And I often think about the question my advisor many years ago asked my PhD advisor, have you thought about doing an ethnography? Because I was interested in discourse and narrative. I'm like, I don't think I'm that good. I'm not that brave. I don't think I can do that. And he's like, yes, you are. I'm like, I'm maybe another time. So I am very well comfortable in that space. I say that because I feel like there aren't a lot of examples that I've seen that I would lift up like yours. And so I just want to appreciate that from a whole perspective and methodologically. I have more, I think, just like engaged questions, and I don't have anything I would have for you to change. I've made some copy edits for you to consider, things that are always going to be there. I always tell folks, don't look after you submit it. You're going to find the error, so don't worry about that. It's more about making peace with it and then be done with it and move on. So I was really intrigued by, I'm looking at on my other screen here, so that's why I'm looking this way. I was really intrigued by the way you organized the different, if you will, manuscripts. So on one hand, I wanted to ask you, like, what are you thinking in terms of sharing this work in a scholarship beyond the dissertation, so that someone asked you about the book, which I was wondering about as well. So I wanted to kind of ask you about that, and meaning, do you have places, journals that you were thinking about, and did that help influence the way you organized the different manuscripts, and or how other thematic organizing helped you make that decision? I was curious, how did you land on that? How did you come to the 3? It worked for me. I wanted to know more about that decision making,
Mhm.
and then how you're then thinking about where you're going to publish this work, where are you going to share this work?
Yeah, so it actually is a combination of those 2 considerations, where I'd like to publish and basing it on the content, right, the themes that come out, because I don't want to put artificial boxes around the story based on where it might be published if they're not appropriate for the data and the story that I want to tell. But at the same time, I'm thinking about the communities that I would like to engage in this work, and thinking about the accessibility of the story too, and inviting others to, join in the conversation, whatever that looks like. And so that does weigh into those decisions. But at the same time, there is a little bit of a temporal organization to them. So the first one does deal mostly with the early period of time from, becoming a single parent to my earliest engagement with community gardenings involving institutions. The second one has to do with when I'm kind of in the thick of it between my master's program and doctoral program. And then the third one is less time-bound, because the environmental identity piece has always been one of the strongest pieces for me. And so I left that one kind of at the end. The other ways that they're organized, honestly, for the longest time, there were all these vignettes and pieces of analysis in one big, huge, messy document. And I started sort of like, just as I worked through each story, I just started to see that, this piece is actually more about the food justice parts of things, and, working in, the choices that are made available to some and not others because they have different means. Or this has a lot to do with like sort of the invisibility or the shyness that I had about being in a certain place and appearing in a certain way, and code switching and things like that. And where's the environment that I feel that the most? I feel it in the thick of things when I'm in my doctoral program. And so as I'm combing through the data and combing through the story, and really like it started to gel into these 3. So
Got it. That's helpful. Have you,
Um,
what
did-
venues are you thinking for the 3?
What's that? Which journals?
Yeah, or whatever format you're looking to publish in.
Yeah.
Kim is an
Oh, I know.
editor.
I know. Yeah.
On the editorial board of perhaps one that is relevant.
Yeah. The
Right,
J-
yeah. I mean, that is a consideration. Journals, both, yeah, I just want to hear from you first.
I do have a first and a second target journal for each of the pieces, and yours is one of them, but I just finished my presentation and I can't think of what they are, but I have them
Okay.
and very accessible. One has to do with more of the community food. One has to do with critical autoethnography. So it's either the Journal of Autoethnography or critical questions. It's kind of a funny word or a funny title. It has the word critical in it.
Okay. So,
And-
so more of a methodologically uplifted piece.
Yes,
Yes.
great way of saying that. Yes, thank you.
Great. And then perhaps you're thinking about the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development, more of a praxis focus.
Mhm.
That's helpful. I wonder about the last piece. I was almost imagining, and I guess this is the journal I probably would not have much insight on, but journals that are focused on the environmental educator identity.
Mhm.
This feels like that would be really appropriate in that more of a profession, and I say this in the way that I'm thinking about how the scholarship and the professionalization of that work that you're trying to, there's a, if you will, flipping the script a little bit. And so how that's gonna have an impact in an environmental educator scholarship space. And so I would think that might be something to consider as well. But again, I would not be the person to ask what journals those would be, and you all would know better. But I really thought your first piece, it was really intriguing to me. And I could see how they tie. It was really, I was wanting to hear how you made some of those decisions. I was honestly, that's why I love story, because people can connect to them and make meaning from them and then contribute back to the collective meaning. And I was doing that myself. I felt like myself living through some questions that I remember having real lived experiences around sitting in the WIC office, arguing with people about why can't I purchase this kind of peanut butter? This is ridiculous.
Oh my God, the peanut butter.
the peanut butter. I still have I'm still pissed off about that, And it kind of came back to me. I'm like, oh, right.
Yeah.
And so I just want to thank you for that. It was things that the class identity components. I mean, I share that. I mean, it was as helpful the way you, I think, layered that, because I mean, I'm just saying that's my own lived experience, but the idea that your pieces are going to allow for people to be generative. And I think that's something I may even recommend offering if you say that in a way that I don't see that's explicit. And I want to maybe encourage you to think about that. This is where the ontological space, things that I'm thinking about a lot of my work. So encouraging the role of autoethnography in one way, but the reasons why we tell stories and how the power of story sharing and story listening is to create the possible, the politics of the possible here. And what does it mean for people to question normative and sometimes polemic and just, and often oppressive narratives that we live in. So here's your chance. Your recommendations like, let's not think about an undignified charitable frame. Let's think about that everyone deserves to live the good life, and how can we all make space for that, even in the toughest of times. In fact, maybe most importantly, in the toughest of times. And so I just thought you do that. So I was like, this is what I think about a lot of my community footwork narrative research, that this is the everydayness that often doesn't get uplifted. It's not just the big structural critiques. Yes, and you do that. And I'm all about that as a sociologist, but I also am really interested in uplifting praxis. And you do that very well. So I just want to think about the generativeness to help others think about their praxis.
Yeah, that really, really is the point. I really wanted other people to see themselves in the garden, see themselves in the story. So if that's been done effectively, I'm really grateful.
Yeah, I think so. So in terms of maybe just considering and then maybe not necessarily in the dissertation at this stage, but thinking about that as you write for, because you're gonna need to revisit these for the exact submissions and stuff. But thinking about what it means, that role between generative possibility and story and praxis, I think that would be really successful for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I don't think I had, so my students know I do this, but I always love these questions about, in the beginning, you kind of touch on your ontological epistemic kind of, framing, and then you revisit it actually in the end. I think you talk more about it in the end. And I was wondering about that as part of your reflexivity, if you might consider strengthening it up in the front a little bit, because I think that's, for me, it feels important, because how do you understand even, how is knowledge treated here, and how does that help you as a autoethnographer? So I was just wondering if you either could share more about that, that was just more of an observation and maybe stylistic. And again, I'm always mindful that there's different styles and different, disciplinary homes, and I don't want to ever impose, this is what I do. It's more about what makes sense for you. At the same time, I thought there was an opportunity there to maybe strengthen that the ideation around your ontoepistemic claims in the
The introduction chapter, you mean?
yeah, and I didn't see any particular references attached to those. So I was like, okay, maybe is this an opportunity to strengthen that a little bit. Again, that's maybe more stylistic on my part.
Sure. No, that's a
I
good
just noted it in I just noted that in the version here I'll send to you, but it was more a point, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think it always behooves people working in, say, emerging research methods to, to make a case to those who may be experiencing this for the first time. It's just one of the burdens that falls to us for our choices, where we don't. Other research might just, justify their sample size.
Right.
We have to do a lot more heavy lifting.
Right.
To say,
Without
yes,
sort
this
of
is knowledge.
apologizing for the methodology.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, an apologist in, the best sense of the word.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, this is why this is necessary. This is why this is good. This is why it works. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's about clarity of messaging of how you understand knowledge in your research, and then how you will then make claim about how knowledge has been created and shared. So yeah, I've actually had to, deprogram some of my own students. Like, no, I've never asked you to apologize for anything that we're doing, and push back on that for sure. It's just, yeah, clarity.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to the authors, like Tony Adams and Stacey Holman Jones, and I think Winkler is referenced in here too, that really describe in a very, I was going to say scientific, but they can speak to both the academic and to the lay audience so well with that. So I know that I have people that I can lean on in order to do that. So
That's great. And I think I had just one last question. Maybe it's a collective question. I was curious how the interviews were. I think I was curious to know more about the interviews. How did those work? How did you collected the interview? You conducted some interviews of obviously, and your memoing from them is what then became data. And then I was wondering about the interview itself, in essence, is also data. And so I was curious how, and this is maybe a point of curiosity around autoethnography, pulling in different datum, and then you have your data. And so I was like, how does that work? I wanted to know more about how you might share that, or is that appropriate to share? And more like, this is what I like in their own words, like sharing that with the reader, and then your engagement with that meaning. And so I was just curious I was maybe wanting to know more about that from a methodological perspective, and just understanding how that could be a strength, or maybe that's a distraction. So I open that more of a clarification for all of us. So I would love to, perhaps you could educate me on that process.
sure. I wish that I had done more with the interviews, actually. I would like to go back and, if I take people up on the suggestion to write a book, I'll definitely go back into the interviews in more depth. I think they had a couple of really important utilities. One was to gather data that I couldn't access myself through personal memory and reflection. I relied on someone else's experience of events, our work together, being in the same place and time and doing a thing together, relied on them to provide me data that I couldn't have accessed otherwise. It also helped in the self-reflection part because might have been something that we both remember, but they put a different emphasis on it. It meant something, either it was more interesting to them or less interesting, or it was more problematic or less problematic, or it was really like something so memorable for them where I just didn't think a second thought about it. I'm thinking of an example that I interviewed a colleague at a different institution about our campus garden efforts, and they expressed something that was disappointing about that experience, just as an example. And I thought, I was really disappointed about that too, but we might have had different reasons that we were disappointed about that connected to either institutional culture or student learning goals or something like that. So those kinds of differences led me to do more self-reflection data. And that led into more of a nuanced story. And so even though I would not quote directly or identify the person in that interview, their presence is in there indirectly through that self-reflection and through the ending, the way the story ended up the way it did. So they, kind of steered me to emphasize one thing or another, if that makes sense. Does that kind of get to your question?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think that's it. That makes sense to me. And hearing you, like your interest in perhaps pursuing more, and I think the book idea is a really excellent one. So it's hopefully you give that some consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
I'll stop there.
that's all right. I have another question I'd like to ask Jess, and in some ways it has to do with the experience of power and powerlessness. And in some ways, it's the particular gift of being doing research in environmental studies. And it might have to do with the limits of how you understand social identity too. I'll bring in my experience as a gardener, which is sometimes very hard and creates ethical dilemmas for me. We have the possibility more and more in our field to bring in nature, the more than human world, the garden itself, the critters that eat our gardens that aren't us. And I guess I sort of felt like that was missing. In some ways, using your garden metaphors brings it in maybe a literary and somewhat experiential way. But I'm just wondering about that, sometimes dark side, sometimes very awesome side that, frankly brings me to my knees in terms of my own identity when I plant a seed and it actually sprouts, or when, the groundhog eats the tomatoes that I was really hoping to eat myself. Can you say more about power relations in relation to the more than human community that these gardens are embedded in?
I think I touch on climate change and the question of peak oil in the beginning, and how that was part of the context and the impetus for wanting to grow more of my own food. And so it's there in a small way, but I think you're right that it's not explicit in places where it could be, to add to the reader's really to add a more material aspect to what it's like to be a gardener. I can think of I think about Westmoreland as you're describing that.
Same. I'm totally thinking of a time, well, first year, and I had a groundhog literally run over my hand as I'm, gardening out there.
Yep.
It was just such a mess.
And Alex dealt with that groundhog.
And we're still dealing with those dark groundhogs, but it was a visceral experience with a more than human world.
Yeah.
Literally walk, like running across my hand.
Exactly. Yeah. If you've had voles, if you've had squash bugs, if you've had that hailstorm 2 weeks after you put out your tomato sets, these are all very typical kinds of things. Gosh, I keep losing what I'm on the edge of trying to say with this. I guess it's a way of challenging one of the, I think, dominant narratives is a kind of romanticization of growing your own food, especially for people who are not privileged, that, oh, they just need to go back to the land. They just need, I kind of look with the ambivalence on Roland's effort to create this giving garden at the community garden, because I feel like, man, could I just give some money? Because it is so hard to grow vegetables. And, there's just not going to be that many, and they're just not going to be that high quality. What I think your point, what else do we get out of gardening besides the food is helpful for me to remember. But I think this is part of the discourse that you've probably had to contend with, and that all people who are getting into community garden may need to contend with. So many people come out in the best, most inspired way to start a plot, often right next to mine. And then by the end of July, they're gone and the plot is full of ragweed, and it's hard work. It's often disappointing. That doesn't even get to the human side of the people that walk through and pick your pumpkin, who aren't gardeners, or, fighting over the hoses when there's a very limited water supply. The challenges of gardening in a community. So I guess it's important to me that that gardening not be painted with or seen with rose tinted glasses, and that the reality of the context that we're all in, which is a world that we really have impacted, but even before climate change did not have control over. Gardening is, we look to that Western narrative of be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. But when we think about the people who are creating that narrative, it's like, just try. And every time I go out to my garden, it's like, just try. We really run into our limits.
That's right. How many hours can you afford to take away from a job or raising your family or other things to go out and have your garden, right? How many pairs of shoes can you afford to go through? How many, however, right?
Seeds, they're so expensive.
Yeah, we have struggled with this from day one with community garden connections.
Yeah.
It's not so much about the food, it's more about the social connections with folks who are oftentimes either historically marginalized or quote unquote invisible in the community. And it's not about the 10 tons of food, it's about the connections, and yet it's hard to rationalize, right? The fact that we could be expending all that money towards more food, quite frankly, and access. And yet there's all these intangibles and, your experiences, quite frankly. Anyway, it's humbling.
I think behind your point too is a sense of ableism, maybe. And like, I don't address ableism directly here, but that's one of the things that I do carry into the garden. I'm physically and cognitively very capable, and I take that for granted. And so why would I write about it, right? Right, unless it's in a community context. So,
yeah, just a thought, and I think an opportunity. I'm always pushing for the voice of that other.
Well, and Joy, you led with this too, the limits of social identity and that concept, and you could go in lots of different ways, I think, Jess. And if you were to bound it by the human social aspect for this research, which is what I suspect you did, and then within the research recommendations, it's a different question, right? what is social identity, personal identity, community gardening? What's the relationship with that and the more than human world?
Yeah, and it is a strong thread in environmental studies that so much of environmental identity is developed and expressed through contact with the more than human world, through pilgrimage in nature, through so-called wilderness experience, through the ocean, through encountering climate change, and I don't want that piece to be lost ever. I think too many of our problems come from assuming that the earth is just a stage on which, human beings act out their relationships to each other, and very much taken for granted. So yeah, that may be a place for it, Libby, that doesn't disrupt the work that Jess has already done, but acknowledges that this it's a dangerous discourse, and that gardening is pleasant, easy, that we're capable of it, all of us, that we don't get ticks and sunburn and poison ivy and have to decide, am I going to put an electric fence around my raised beds? Or just give up gardening like my neighbors have. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that you have access to, either a community plot or a private land of your own. And if you're a renter or in an urban environment, you might not even have that. So that's
Right, yeah, lead in the soil and, all that. Yeah, so there are these problematic aspects too, and you can't cover everything, you can't experience everything, but just something I wanted to bring in.
That's great. Thank you. That's important.
Appreciate that.
Additional questions, comments, concerns for Jess before we sort of take a few minutes, Kim and Joy and myself, to confer?
I
I'm
perhaps,
ready to move on. Mhm.
yeah, no, I'm happy. I just wanted, if we, hopefully we'll love to hear from, Jess, what your next steps in your journey look like. So perhaps we'll get to that in a little bit.
Okay. And Joy, was that
Yeah, I'm ready to move on, although with the caveat, Jess, that we will have to get together so we can talk more in depth about some things that interest me that you have learned that I might just want to incorporate in my own practice as a gardener and community member. So.
Yeah, we should. And I should mention to you both that I want to offer you a gift of some seeds. So Kim, I'll have to send yours in the mail. Joy, I might bring yours in person. There's carrot, calendula, and lupin seeds that all came out of my garden.
Oh,
Nice.
that is lovely. I really appreciate that.
You can visit your hazelnut trees that you gave me last year. They're doing well.
That'll be good.
lovely?
Well, thank you again so much. Thank you for being part of this journey.